Welcome back to the World Extreme Medicine podcast. My name's Will Duffin, GP and Education Lead. If you're a paramedic, doctor, nurse, physio, or indeed anyone working in healthcare who has a curious and adventurous mind, then this is the podcast for you. Given the current circumstances, we're not able to run our usual face-to-face expedition medicine courses that normally take place around the world. So instead, we're bringing world-class minds directly to your earbuds. So please sit back and enjoy. My guest today, hailing from Sydney, Australia, is a Guinness World Record holding explorer, documentary maker, and keynote speaker, Justin Jones. Let me give you a flavour of some of the crazy shit this guy's done. In 2008, he completed the first crossing of the Tasman Sea by kayak. That's from Australia to New Zealand, completely unsupported. Then in 2012, also with his adventure buddy Kaz, they skied 2,200 kilometers from the geographical edge of Antarctica to the South Pole and back over 89 days, again, completely unsupported, setting another world first. Then in 2017, he got the whole family involved, and alongside his wife, Lauren, and then 15-month-old daughter, Morgan, they undertook an 1,800 kilometer trek across the Aussie outback over 102 days, living wild. Jonesy's a colourful character and also a passionate storyteller. Mate, welcome to the podcast.
Will, thank you so much for having me. Can you just come around with me wherever I go? Because that intro is fantastic. You need to tell my wife that, I think.
Great. I'm glad you liked it. So how are things? You're in Bondi, I gather. How are things over there at the moment, Jonesy?
Yeah, pretty good down in Bondi, actually. We haven't really had a real severe hit from this whole COVID pandemic, but I think that's because of the fact that we've jumped onto lockdown pretty quickly. Bondi, it's a pretty nice place to be socially isolated, I suppose, in quarantine of sorts, because we can still escape off and climb down the cliff lines and jump into the water and get that nature fix that I in particular really crave and need.
Because I saw the beach was rammed pre-lockdown, and then all the police came in and shut it down, didn't they?
Yeah, we had one really hot weekend where I think people were a little bit silly and they came down in their droves. Think about it, there was I'm not going to say how many thousands or hundreds of people down on the beach, but they just weren't really paying the respect to actually what was going on and what they should be doing. And so the police, after that, locked down, no more beach access, and that was it. We've finally opened back up today. The beaches are open, but it's only for swimming for exercise.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And it sounds like in Australia as well, things are just starting to open up again. Is that right?
They are opening up. There's a collective sort of breath that everyone's having at the moment. It's like, well, we haven't seen this big hit that we thought was going to come. The public health system hasn't been overwhelmed, so everyone is now itching to get life back to normal. But it's not going to become normal. It's not going to go back to the normal we once knew. It's going to be a new normal. It's going to be post COVID. And so this is going to be an interesting world we're entering into. And I know this sounds strange and it could be slightly insensitive. I'm excited by this in a sense, because for once it feels like the entire world is on an adventure together. Like we really are. Like people are weathering the storm in better ways than other people, but in reality, we're all going through this, and we're all going to emerge on the other side, having gone through this journey. And I think that's a phenomenal thing to be part of. I mean, this is a point in time in history, and hopefully, we all band together and change for the better.
And I think you possibly better than anyone knows that a good journey is built from adversity. There needs to be some kind of jeopardy along the way for that journey to be forged. And I think the people that will really struggle with the post-COVID era world will be the ones that don't acknowledge what's happened and accept that new normal, and are still trying to recreate a world in the way that it was before the pandemic.
I think actually a nice analogy to use here is actually probably looking at kids. anyone that's had kids, if you try and go back to your life before kids and live the same way, you just can't do it. You can't do it. So
Yeah.
you've got to accept that things have changed, the circumstances have changed, everything's changed, and go, all right, well, we've got to find that new balance, that new normal, and make it better, you know? And with kids, yeah, it is hard at certain times. You know, those nights are very long, and we are in the long night. But it does get better, and it comes good. It really does.
Yeah, do you know what? As a parent of an 11-month-old, it's so great to hear that. You know, my wife and I aren't sleeping a great deal at the moment, so that gives us huge hope.
Yeah, well, on aside from everything, can I give you some personal advice that someone once gave me for our
Go
first
ahead.
child? They said, kids with kids, the nights are so long, but the months are so short. So, and I think that has been something that's sunk in my mind. And so, when it is feeling really bad, knowing that it will pass, and in a blink of the eye, they're 6, 12 months, 18 months, and then you're walking across the outback with them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that adventure because that is incredibly cool. And I think there's a certain mindset. I think some people I know are really using this time in lockdown as a lifetime. They're really engaged in different projects. They're really looking at ways they can modify what they're doing and still really fill their time in a meaningful, productive way. Whereas I think some people are treating this as dead time. They're really just waiting for this to pass, and I think that would be a huge mistake because even when things are tough, we really life is so short. We really have to savor every moment, don't we?
Yeah, no, we really do. I mean, if you're just sitting there and waiting, you don't know how long this is going to go for. This. I mean, adventure is an activity with an unknown outcome. We're in an unknown right now, so we've got to make the most of it. You know, this. I don't know how long it's going to be before we have a viable vaccine. That you know, a year and a half, 2 years before it can get spread around enough. So you can't put a pause on life for that long. You just cannot. You've got to go out there and go, all right, well, how can I shift and change and adapt to the situation and
Yeah,
reality?
absolutely. Yeah, totally. Now, in lockdown, many of us adventurous types are not able to get out there and have real adventures. So there's a huge appetite for just some ripping yarns, some adventure tales, and I think you have those in abundance, Jonesy. We'd love to hear about some of the crazy stuff that you've done.
I might have a tale or two, so okay, we can jump into it. And look, yeah, I'll maybe I'll slip in one tall tale and see if you can guess which one that is throughout the hour.
Well, why don't we start with your Tasman Sea crossing by kayak? How on earth did you dream that one up?
That trip was actually born on another expedition. Like, so I honestly think if you want to go on a big expedition, you should go on a smaller one first because these trips naturally just cascade. So to take it back a little bit, I am a bushwalker by nature. So I love my trekking, my tramping. And for me, kayaking was a natural extension of that. It felt like bushwalking on water. So in 2001, myself and two friends from school decided to try and paddle the entire length of Australia's longest river, the Murray River. 2,560 kilometres. And we did that over 49 days, and it was a very Huckleberry Finn style adventure. We were, confused boys at the start of that trip, and we were slightly less confused, slightly more manly boys at the end of it. And I think it did a lot for our self confidence. But it was around day 30, 31 or so that the idea for the Tasman was born on this Murray River paddle. And I will never forget that day because it was about 45 degrees. So the sun is just baking down on us and we're paddling along. And I was over it. I was really over this trip. I wanted to pull up next to the bank and just go to sleep. I was done. And I remember seeing out of the corner of my vision Cass's kite, my mate James Constriction Cass, his kite nudged up in view, and I turned and looked up towards his face, expecting to see that anguish that I'm feeling inside just kind of etched on his face. Instead, he's got this daft grin. He's like, mate, how much fun are we having right now? I'm like, oh shit, he's got heat stroke. I'm like trying to paddle away from him. And he sticks with me. He's like, mate, we should do another journey like this again, But rather than being in on a a closed off inland stretch of water, do you reckon we could do something on the open ocean? Do you think anyone's ever paddled a kayak from Australia to New Zealand? And right then and there, I told him he was a bloody idiot in a lot stronger language than that, and
I
I
can
paddled
just
away from
picture
him.
the crazed look on
Oh,
his face.
it's just madness. Like honestly, madness. And I was just like, you can't paddle a kayak safely across the Tasman Sea. You know, I was the first person to say that. Like, you cannot do it. It is impossible. And so I just paddled away from the bloke, and we didn't talk about this trip for another 2, 3 years. You know, and fast forward, all of a sudden, I'm working. Actually, my background at university was science, exercise physiology. So I'm working in a research lab in 2003, and I get this phone call, and it's from Cass. And I pick up the phone. The first two words he says to me are the ditch, which is colloquially what we call that stretch of water. It's called the ditch between Australia and New Zealand. And I knew he was talking about this journey. And I was like, mate, we cannot paddle. And I kind of stopped myself halfway through saying it's impossible. And I realized that I was like, living a life that wasn't quite my life at that moment. I was in this dungeon of a laboratory in the base of the University of New South Wales, and I was looking around. I was like, hang on a second here. You know, I'm living someone else's life right now because like I've always placed myself in the outdoors, and here I am saying no to the idea of doing a trip, the possibility of doing one, and I don't know anything about this journey. And I'm straight out saying it's not possible. And so I said, actually, hold up, Cass. Look, I'm not going to commit to doing this journey because I think it's ridiculous. But what I will commit to you is that we can sit down and try and work out whether it's possible. Let's just start there. And that stage took 18 months to work out whether it was possible. So a year and a half of research and planning until finally we ended up creating this 100-page document, which is our blueprint to how we could safely get across the Tasman Sea. And we were like, oh, right, shit, it is possible. So now we have to commit to it or not. And
Wow.
that was probably the hardest point of the whole journey.
Wow, because I understand the poor soul that attempted this before you, unfortunately perished.
Yes, there's another paddler by the name of Andrew McCauley. So Andrew McCauley actually he passed away at the start of 2007, so February 2007, and we ended up leaving in November 2007. And Andrew, we were actually trying to leave at the same time. Like it turned into a little bit of a race at the time. And, you know, Andrew was going out there trying to do it solo in a very different fashion from us, but we were both trying to be the first across. And then we had horrific issues with our kayak. And so we had to pull the pin on it and say, well, he's going to take the glory, and we'll, we want to stay alive because our kayak doesn't work properly. So we postponed it until the next season. And, unfortunately, Andrew's kayak was found 80 kilometres off the coast of New Zealand, and they never found him. It was a horrific
Wow.
end to a mammoth journey that he was
Yeah.
pulling off.
Wow. Yeah, that's having that in the back of your mind when you set off, that must have been quite yeah, must left you with an awkward feeling.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I've reflected a lot more on it as I've gotten older. To be completely honest, when Andrew left, he had a 3-year-old son and a wife, and so that becoming a parent that really hit me a lot harder. But also, you know, there was, you know, I had probably I felt a lot of guilt actually to a degree, and I probably germinated and sprouted a little bit more as I got older because uh, I realized if I took a perhaps more of a collaborative approach rather than a combative approach, you know, trying to, you know, race across, maybe there was a way that we would have both delayed our journeys, you know, a year, and it would have been a different end. I mean, you can't change the past, and you know, you can't control other people, but at the same token, I do. It doesn't weigh on my mind. Yeah, it really does.
Yeah. And so you spent 62 days at sea in a tiny double kayak. What were some of the biggest challenges during that time at sea?
Well, I've got to say probably the biggest challenge was getting to the start line because 3.5 years of preparation and planning went into this journey, and so it was a long time to be, you know, 90% in the preparation stage, only 10% in the execution. It's a hard 10%. Don't get me wrong, but out there we were only expecting the journey to go for 35 to 40 days, and that was it. And we ended up doing 62 days. You know, if you were to measure it in a straight line, it's about 2,200 kilometers, the route we were taking. We paddled 3,318 Ks. So we did an extra 50%. So a couple of things went wrong along the way, I should say. We were paddling along and we did a 2 week circle in the middle of Tasman Sea. So we did 2 week circle and we got struck by storms out there with 10 meter waves. So if you're in a room, stare up at that roof and just imagine a wave that's 4 times the height of that ceiling, and these things are like crashing around the kayak. And the ocean has an incredible way of making you feel so small, and
Yes.
those storms do that. So we had
And
that. We
how do
actually,
you keep the kayak? How do you stop it from capsizing in big seas?
yeah. So the most important thing was actually to make sure that you're not broadside to those oncoming waves, because if you were, then you would 100% roll. You would have to. So what we ended up doing was actually throwing out a parachute anchor, and the parachute anchor would sit roughly 50 meters behind the kayak, and it would turn the tail of the kayak towards these oncoming waves. And as a result, we were able to ride out the storms. But what it would do sometimes is the waves would pass over the top of this parachute anchor relatively easily, hit the back end of the kayak, and since it's a nylon rope running back to it, would stretch and shock load the system, and then all of a sudden the pressure would release, and the kayak would actually go through the waves as they're going over the top. So you'd be stuck inside the cabin, and you just get all of a sudden the port lights would go dark, and a wave would go over the top of you. Um, yeah, we never went fully over upside down. I think we got down to about there, and then it was actually quite violent in its self-riding manner. So lucky not to capsize.
Are you someone that gets seasick easily?
I am not, but Cass, my mate, he
Yeah.
actually gets really, really badly seasick. So he's in
Yeah.
that sort of like, I don't know whether it's 5 or 10% of the population that his I don't know, his inner ear just cannot get used to it, and
Mm.
so he ended up having to take a regular anti-seasickness medication, but then antiemetic drugs they give to chemotherapy patients. He was doing
Mm.
self hypnosis out there, and the worst one,
Wow.
well, actually the funniest one, I should say, was actually acupuncture.
Yeah.
So we're in a storm rocking around. He pulls out his acupuncture needles and he's trying to jab it into his wrist, like these little pressure points. And it just made me feel sick. Just watching him start
Yeah.
to pepper his
Yeah.
arm. But what I actually do suffer from is I actually suffer from claustrophobia. And so having this kayak, we designed a little cabin on the back end of it. And that was about the size of a coffin and a half stacked on top of each other. So I didn't love that place, but I kind of had to realize that it was keeping me safe and alive.
So during a storm, you're just hunkered down in this tiny cabin, just the two of you, riding through these waves, just hoping that the storm anchor keeps you pointed in the right direction and just waiting for it to pass.
Yeah, and at times you have to strap yourself down to the floor because you want to use yourself as ballast to hold yourself down so
Yeah.
that you can help right the kayak. And yeah, no, it wasn't comfortable. The length of that cabin, I would say, oh geez, the internal length had probably been 2.5 meters. So my legs were level with Cass's hips and vice versa. And because he had really bad seasickness, he actually got the door. So he got the comfortable end, and I had the roof above my head when I'd lie down, which was about sort of that far off my head, and it was so claustrophobic. It was horrible.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how I did it.
How did you decide where to be in the kayak? Did you do rock, paper, scissors, draw straws?
Oh, you mean in the cabin or actually in the
It's
paddling
like who gets the
positions?
tap end in the bath, right? It's how do you work that out?
Yeah, yeah, no. Well, so in the cabin, his the needs of vomit, like for Cass, like he needed to be able to sort of like exit and vomit as fast as possible. So that went out to my claustrophobia. And in the paddling seats, I always sat in the back. And generally, what you do when you're paddling in a double kayak is you put the heavier, stronger person in the back, but also. Since that's the way we trained, it became kind of second nature for me to take my timing off him paddling. And it was quite funny when we did swap, like we'd be clashing paddles and doing all sorts of stuff. I just got used to it, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. So you just got in the groove, and
Yeah,
there are quite a few sharks in that stretch of water. Did you have any close encounters?
we had a couple of encounters with some sharks. There was one night in particular where I'd actually just been in the water actually to debarnacle the hull, and so the kayak was moving really slowly, and I remember scrubbing these barnacles off, and they drop off, fall into the ocean, and didn't kind of realizing what I was doing was creating a burley trail behind the back of the kayak, and so jump back in the kayak, and the sun is just starting to set and kiss the horizon, and we normally just paddled in the daylight hours, but I was close to being hypothermic because it was cold at that point of the trip, and I we paddled on for about another quarter of an hour. And I will never forget, climbing into the cabin, had my back to the door, and Cass just tapping me on the shoulder. He's like, "Mate, I think there's a shark out here." And I'm like, "Come on, mate. Like you said this morning, you want to see a shark, mate. It's in your imagination. You're just seeing things." And he's like, "No, mate, there's a shark out here." And I'll never forget, there's this big bang, and the kayak lurches over to one side. I'm like, "Shit, there really is." And I grab Cass, and I pull him inside. And we had these two sharks pop up and start kind of grinding and rubbing themselves up against the kayak. Now, I mean, it was quite funny because we were borderline. Actually, to tell the truth, only one shark popped up to start with, and I was trying to convince Cass to actually use the underwater camera, stick it once it had gone past, and stick it underwater and take a shot of it. And I was geeing him up for it because he was right at the door, and he was about to do it when the second shark popped up, and we're like, "Okay, yeah, let's not do that."
Yeah,
But
abort.
yeah, abort. Don't do it, Cass. But it's 3.5 hours they were rubbing their bodies against the kayak, and we found out later that it's something they do when they find a piece of floating debris in the water, and basically they're using it as a parasite scrub. We're a giant loofah for them in the center of the ocean. Just want to scrub their bodies.
Yeah, yeah, and you provided a valuable service to the
Exactly.
marine life of the
Those,
Tasman Sea.
those two sharks are the happiest sharks going around, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, but I bet that freaked you right out though. That time that they were there.
It did, but I mean, like yeah, look, it did. But the same token, when you're sheltered away in the cabin, you feel quite secure. We had layers of Kevlar running through the entire hull of the kayak, and so you could probably shoot a 303 rifle at it and it wouldn't penetrate. But where we felt more, I suppose, exposed was when we were actually paddling, and you get your hands skimming over the top of the water. And I'll never forget one day seeing we get fascinated by things we find in the water. I mean, yeah, there was some rubbish and debris, but you'd find like a floating buoy, and then underneath the floating buoy would be a whole ecosystem because there'd be barnacles, then there'd be fish underneath it, and then you get mahi, like dolphin fish coming past. And so we saw this black buoy in the water, and we're like, "Oh wow, awesome! Okay, let's go check it out because there'll be probably be fish life around it." And I remember turning the kayak, 30 degrees and paddling towards it. And then like I'm focused on the compass bearing and where we're going. And then Cass is like, "Oh mate, you're gonna miss it. You've gone off course." And I'm like, "No, I'm on the right bearing." We get up to about 20 meters away from it, and we realize it's a big black fin sticking out of the water about a foot and a half. And we're like, "Okay, just turn the kayak, keep going back
Mm.
towards New Zealand." That's when you felt exposed, yeah.
Yeah, I bet. But you did it.
Yeah,
It must have been an amazing feeling when you got to the other side, when you got to New Zealand.
it was phenomenal. It was crazy. I mean, so we paddled into Namutu Beach in New Plymouth, on the Taranaki coast of the North Island of New Zealand, and I will never forget coming around the break wall there and saying something really stupid to Cass. I'm like, "Oh mate, look, I hate to say it. Like, granted, I wore contacts back then, but I said, mate, I think they've done something really stupid with their foreshore." And I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" He's like, "I think they've painted all their rocks different colors." And he's like, "No, you idiot, they're people. We had 25,000 people come
Wow.
down." Yeah, honestly, it was
Yeah.
25,000 people down there in a region that only has about 45,000 people in total. And it
Yeah.
was phenomenal. I'll never forget jumping off that kayak, feeling that sand come up between my toes and
Yeah.
staggering up between all these people. It was a phenomenal day, phenomenal experience.
Wow. What an incredible moment that must have been.
Crazy, yeah, crazy.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing gets you hooked on adventure. I mean, it really does.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you were so hooked that you set your sights on Antarctica. So a completely different beast. You're moving out of the kayak, you're moving on to skis, you're going from 10-foot breaking waves to uh, whiteout blizzards, temperatures as low as -40. Uh, Tell me how you got into the Antarctic trip.
Yeah, no. So, well, okay. When we got back from the Tasman, by the way, it was 10 meter breaking waves, not 10 foot. Um,
10, very
when
important.
when we got back from the Tasman, uh, a couple of things were going on. So I look, that's going to stroke your ego a little bit. I think when you see, and I can say this honestly now because I think I've had time to reflect on it and I've grown as a person. But there was a lot of ego caught up in those trips. It was, and not about trying to be arrogant or anything like that. It's about wanting to matter, wanting to do something significant, wanting to people to take an interest. And when you get a response like that, and worldwide media going crazy, um, yeah, you start to think about what you could do next. And the question everyone asks you after, like, how was the sharks? How'd you go to the toilet? Out there in the kayak. The next question would be, what's next? And a lot, or where are you going to kayak to next? And I am definitely not an expert in anything, and I don't ever really want to be per se. And so I think that if we were to go off and get into the trap of trying to kayak further distances or bigger oceans or this, that, the other, then you will eventually find the point between safety and too far. And so I don't ever want to experience that. And so change tack course completely. So Antarctica. Antarctica was something that we actually talked about a little bit on the Tasman. So, like I said, those trips, they lead on to the other journeys. We I remember looking off to the right hand side of the kayak, and we were talking about that landmass down there to the right, 3,000, 4,000 kilometers to the right, and could we imagine doing a journey down there and imagining these waves on the ocean, but instead of being blue, they were white and frozen. And so this kernel and idea sort of popped in our heads about maybe our next journey should be Antarctica. So the Tasman kind of felt like if it really took the blinkers off our eyes, and we thought, you know what, Antarctica before was the too hard basket, too expensive, too cold, too hostile to get to. Just push that idea away. But now we're like, how can we get down there? So we started doing some research, and we were quite stunned to realize that no one had done a ski trip that had gone from, I suppose, the geographical edge of Antarctica to the South Pole and back, unsupported and unassisted. And the polar world is a very funny thing because it's very definition based. So that's not to say that that trip hadn't been done, with kite skis, or people haven't done bigger and greater trips there in terms of distance. But no one had done this trip from the coast there, that edge, to the South Pole and back under their own steam. Other people had, relied on dog teams or wind assistance or tractors, and so we're like, right, we're going to do this. We're going to try and do this journey, and we I should admit that 15 months before we head down to Antarctica, we didn't know how to ski. So, I mean, Australians, yeah, you look, Australia's not a country where you expect great skiers to necessarily come from. So we had to have a very steep learning curve, and over the next 2.5 years in total, got ready for this trip, learned to ski in 15 months, and headed down and embarked on this journey across Antarctica. And it was a phenomenal ride. Like it was probably the hardest journey I've done physically in my life. We were pulling sleds at the start of the journey that weighed 160 kilos each. Um, in temperatures. The coldest we probably got on that trip was probably minus 30s, minus 38. And yeah, it was a phenomenal journey. It really tore us apart.
Wow, I mean that the weight of that sled, 160 kilograms. You've got no dog team. It's just all on you. I mean, the calorie burn, the strain in your bodies from doing that must have been phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of calories. I mean, like I could probably be corrected, but you're burning so many calories. It's probably the order of 9 to 10,000 calories per day per person. And we had only budgeted taking 6,000. Well, actually, our diet was a staggered diet. It was a 6-day rotation where there was 3 days of 6,000 calories, 2 days of 5,500, and one day of 5,000. So we had to keep our weight below a certain amount, otherwise the sleds get too heavy. And by staggering it like that, the thought pattern was you can actually kind of trick your body into when you're on a lower calorie day, it actually kind of doesn't necessarily think it is. So even obviously you are, but like you don't go into muscle breakdown as bad as you probably should. Now we at around, because we made such slow progress, that first probably in the first week of the journey, end of the first week, we started getting snow falling, and so Antarctica is technically a desert. We had a really bad season where we got a lot of snow. So we had a foot and a half of fresh snow fall. And when you're trying to drag a sled that heavy through that kind of snow, it is absolutely horrible. It tears you apart. We were lucky to be averaging 900 meters every hour. And by day 30 of the journey, we had only covered 300 kilometers. We had another 1,980 odd kilometers to do in the remaining 2 months of the journey, because that's when the final plane flight of the season would leave that portion of Antarctica. And yeah, so at day 37, I remember us having to make the hard call that every second day was going to be half rations. So all of a sudden you're down to 2,500 to 3,000 calories every second day, and that's when the weight loss really happened. Like over the course of that journey, I lost 30 kilos of weight the entire
Yeah,
trip.
that's a
Yeah.
lot. You must have been starving the whole time.
It's quite funny. The first 2 weeks of the journey, I was actually pretty good. Like I wasn't starving, I wasn't crazy. But then the hunger was like the weeks I'd say 3 and 4 were like okay, and then that stretch between day 68 to 83, I never want to feel that hungry in my life again. Like I never do it. At this point in the journey, I was passing blood actually when I go to the toilet, but the back end of the journey, I'd be passing blood. The stomach pains I'd feel were just horrific. And I remember we used to divide our rations up each night, and you'd sit there with your ration pack for the next day, and you're trying to go to sleep on this empty stomach. And like I think one night I ate half a tube of toothpaste, and I was just so hungry. And seeing this pack of rations, and you go, oh, I'll just have a couple of bites. I'll just have a couple of bites. And you eat some, and then before you know it, you've eaten through half your rations for the next day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And talk about refeeding syndrome. When we got back from it,
Yeah.
I put on a lot of weight really fast.
Yeah. Well, ready for your next polar trek.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, the mind was a little bit shot, but I actually put on. I finished the journey at 76 kilos. So started at 106 kilos, finished at 76 kilos, and the only time in my adult life that I've been lighter than Cass, my mate.
Yeah.
So, but we got stuck down the base down in Antarctica for 3 days, and when we boarded that flight to go back home, we had to jump on the scales. I weighed 88 kilos, so I'd put on 12 kilos in 3 days.
Yeah, well, why wouldn't you? I mean, when you've just come out of an experience like that, I know I would just eat everything and anything. It must have been amazing to get some food into you after that
Yeah,
experience.
it was, but it did hurt. It actually really hurt. So
Yeah.
I remember sitting down. There was this pile of white chocolate brownies sitting in the base camp there, and I was having a beer,
Yeah.
and these brownies were just sitting there. And so I was just like, I think I ate 32 of them.
Good
And
work.
that night, incredible stomach pain, refeeding syndrome. So yeah, it was
Yeah.
not healthy.
Be
Not healthy.
careful.
Yeah.
But I mean, with that degree of calorie burn and with the rations that you had to minimize the weight of the sled towards the end of that trip, did your body really start to feel it? Did you get to the point where you're very weak, that you had a worry that perhaps you were not going to be able to complete this?
Yeah, I mean that was always there in the back of the mind. I mean, because you look down. It was very rare that we were like you got naked down in a place like Antarctica, but every now and then you'd be swapping over a shirt or something like that, or like swapping from your dirty shirt to your slightly less dirty one, thermal top, and you look down, you wasted away. You look down, and you wouldn't recognize the body, and the pain and weakness. Yeah, that you definitely felt like that. It really became a mental battle. It really did. It was just like, well, you just need to go through the motions. You've trained for this. You know what you're doing. So just go through the motions of that day. Uh, I'll never forget when we finished that journey, trying to climb back into the plane that was going to take us from our finish point at Hercules Inlet to Union Glacier, the base. Struggling to lift feet up to go into the ladder, to take us onto the plane, because that wasn't a motion that the bodies needed to do. You're shuffling, you're skiing down in Antarctica, you're not stepping up and down it so much, and so those muscles waste away. You become, or the only muscles that you'll keep really are the ones that you need to propel yourself on a flat or a relatively flat surface.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
And what's it like trying to navigate through a complete whiteout? Because you had some pretty savage conditions out there.
Yeah, no, we definitely did. So we had a good 2 weeks worth of whiteouts in that first half or first third of that journey, and what that means is that you have to stare at a waist-mounted compass. If you're the front person, you'd have your bearing for the day, and it's what were we on? It's like I think it was 130 degrees south, which was because of the magnetic poles off to the side, so you're actually not going straight south, and we so the front person would stare at your compass the entire day, basically, because it felt like you were floating in white. You couldn't see the lumps and bumps of the snow underneath your feet. There was no contrast, and you just stare at the compass. Now the rear person would follow the other person, check his compass every now and then. But the strange thing is, because you're pulling your sled and it's heavy, you're kind of on that angle as you're moving forward. And since you have no horizon to sort of focus on, your brain resets on what it thinks the horizon should be. So you're on an angle like that, it thinks the horizon's down. And so your mate, who's 10 meters in front of you, feels like he's floating 5 meters above you. And it's the most bizarre sensation. It really is. But yeah, you get used to it. It's just polar travel down there. You learn that, if you are able to keep your skis parallel as much as possible, you don't have to check the compass as much. Or when you do, are able to see the sastrugi patterns, generally the wind is coming from a very consistent direction, so you know what kind of patterns it makes in the snow, and you just line up the angle actually on your skis to the sastrugi as well, and that means you'll be on the right course, unless you're 180 degrees opposite.
Yeah, I can't imagine 2 weeks of that.
Yeah, no, it does grind on you, and that's when we had some good fights, actually, on this. And it's a reflection not on the fact that, I hated the other bloke. It's a reflection on the situation. You're dragging a sled, you're going nowhere, you've made 10 kilometers in a day, and it feels like a trip slipping between your fingers. I mean, a lot of people would probably be feeling this way in this whole pandemic at the moment. And, you want to lash out and you want something to sort of react back to you, and the other person is the only thing out there. And so our biggest fight on the Antarctic trip was because one morning I made Cass's cup of tea wrong, if you can believe it. Yeah, I put the powdered milk in before the tea bag, and yeah, it resulted.
Basically, you fucked up big time.
Yeah, I did, exactly. I know. I haven't got a sympathetic person to talk to, and you will. You're meant to be on my side, but it's a cup of tea. Granted, it's a cup of tea. Yeah, so I was in the shit for a while, and then it's nice to be able to laugh about it now because it was about the situation. The Tasman, though, the biggest fight we had on the Tasman journey was when we'd start our day off by sharing like half a Mars bar or something. And I'll never forget, we'd split a Mars bar, and Cass made a comment as he's eating his half of the Mars bar and I'm pulling in the parachute anchor, about to start paddling. He said something really negative, and I was like, oh, it could be worse. It could be X, Y, Z. And he's like, yeah, you're right, it could be worse. And he took my half of the Mars bar and just chucks it in the water. And oh my gosh, there was a massive fight that happened after that. I almost hit the head with the paddle, like, honestly.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, my experience of being in places where we're in very close knit teams, there's a lot of pressure to perform. These tiny little things can take on a whole new significance, can't they? And tensions, everyone can be on edge, and you find yourself getting very, very reactive.
I'm going to ask you a question, Will. What's your go-to strategy for conflict resolution in high stress situations?
So it's a great question. In fact, I was talking about this with one of our other guests only the other day, and we were talking about self-awareness, and I think that's really the key is the power that lies in the gap between stimulus and response, and buying yourself a little bit of time. So when someone's pissing you off, when they're doing something like making your tea wrong or doing something with a Mars bar, whatever it is, rather than allowing yourself to react impulsively and through emotion, you just step back from that moment and you create a bit of gap. And I've found that the more I can cultivate that, the more I'm then able to respond in a considered way that's in accordance with my values, and out of it shows respect to that person, a bit more understanding and compassion. But that only comes from not allowing your emotional brain to just hijack the situation. Yeah. So that's the gap between stimulus and response. That's the thing that I've been trying to cultivate. And I'm not saying it's easy. Like everyone, I have moments where I kick off at people, but that's what I'm working on.
No, that's really good. I think I was actually I hold a philosophy that's very similar to that. And, it's taking that time to pause and just because well, we had a policy on most of my trips. I've had a policy of complete disclosure. So it is complete disclosure. You can tell the other person how you feel, but there's a caveat to that. And the reason why it's complete disclosure is because you cannot have grudges festering away that's going to undermine team dynamics. You got to get it out, lance it as fast as possible, so that because you're trusting this person with your life. And if you're in a highly functioning team, you need to have that quick response and trust. And so complete disclosure, but just hold that for 12 hours. If you've got a massive gripe, hold it for 12 hours. And when you're by yourself, say what that gripe is out in the open, because half the time, when you're in an argument, you're saying something and you realize what you're saying is about you, not the other person, but you are too committed and you will go down that, you'll sink with the ship because you don't want to take a backward step. And I find with men in particular, that's very true. Women are a little bit more circumspect. They'll, be able to realize, oh shit, I was probably a little bit off there. Whereas a guy will run with it for a while before they'll finally admit their faults.
I think there is definitely a gender difference there, and I think what an added dimension. You've mentioned the kind of the ego side of things. I found as a medic covering trips where you're in extreme environments, there's a lot of pressure on you to be almost superhuman. People often ask, what's going to happen if you get sick? Who's going to look after us? And you think, oh well, I better not get sick then. I've just got to be putting on this this facade that I'm totally cool with all of this. I've got this. When that we know that that's rubbish, because we'll have days when we struggle, and there are days when you're not really able to bring your A game. We're only human, and I think having the self-awareness to be not only know that you're not in a good place that day and you're going to snap at people, but then also to, like you say, have full disclosure to the rest of the team, or your adventure partner, just to be able to say, hey, do you know what, mate? I'm not really feeling it today. I'm getting a bit pissed off. And you could even say what's pissing you off and say, look, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a bit snappy, just so you know. Is that all right? And I'm not always able to do that because I think ego and pride often prevents me from doing that. But I really wish I could bring that more often.
It's actually, ego is a very, very interesting thing. And I learn a lot, and we'll get into the third trip soonish, but I learned a lot from that trip and being out there with Lauren about how being with a person who unconditionally loves you can be a bit of a curse, because it means that sometimes you put on a facade that's actually not bad in those it's positive in a tough environment, because you won't sort of let those emotions out. Because I was around my wife, at times I was emotionally dumping on her, and she was like, "Whoa, hang on! You can't use me as your whipping post to like tell me all these issues you're having." And and it was quite interesting. I reflected on that. I was like, "You're right. Actually, if you were there is a gender thing going on. There's a fact that I trust you, and if you're another bloke that was an adventure peer, I wouldn't be talking about these things to you, and I'd just be getting along with it." And so she said, "It's really unfair that you're dumping that on me." And I had to sort of take a step back and go, "Yeah, you're right. Whoops."
Yeah, I mean, that is a whole different ball game, I think, when your adventure partner is your wife. I don't know about you, but I find I lose all kinds of objectivity when it's someone that's really close to you and you have that kind of emotional connection to. I think it really must have made things, especially when you throw an 1,800-kilometer trek and a 15-month-old in the mix. That must have tensions must have frayed.
Yeah, the degree of difficulty of that trip was, all in who we were bringing. I mean, the 15 months old. Yeah, if I was to classify the three trips, I'd do them this way:
Yeah.
the Tasman, highest risk of death; Antarctica, highest risk of injury; Outback, highest risk of divorce. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think I won an argument that entire journey, because
Yeah.
you can't argue in the same way with a spouse or a
No.
loved one than you can an expedition buddy. And yeah, because there would be a end scenario worse than death from a journey like that, and that's that we irrevocably broke our relationship and our marriage, and came back from that with that fractured. And that for me it would be worse than death. So yeah, there were times out there where you'd have these fights, and you'd think, geez, have I done the wrong thing by bringing my family out here? Or am I testing us too far? Pushing us too far? Luckily, we're still together. We've had another kid since then, so yeah, I think we're on the right path.
Yeah, wow. And let's move on to onto that trip a little bit. So, many people who are in their 30s who've been on lots of exciting adventures, they are left with the impression that as soon as kids happen, it's game over. You've you've gone against the grain, and you've proved that it is still possible to have crazy madcap adventures with a child in tow. And yeah, tell us what that was like.
Right. Okay. So yeah, we were. I coming back from Antarctica, so I'm a bit stunned right now thinking about this because it does seem crazy to me still. Uh, Coming back from Antarctica, I wanted to do another big journey. I really did, and I there's a bit of a story I should tell about Antarctica in that we were because it relates to it. We were down in Antarctica trying to do this journey, and there was another chap who was also trying to do the exact same trip as us, a Norwegian bloke by the name of Alexander Gamming. And he was, he's a polar guru compared to us. We're like, he's Norwegian, he's
Yeah,
got
yeah.
ice in his veins, he's a breech birth, he's had to pull him out by his skis, He
Oh, so this is an Amundsen Scott style
100%, 100%.
situation. Yeah,
Yeah, and so there's us, playing the role
yeah,
of Captain Scott and Roald Amundsen, Alexander Gammy over there on the other side of the fence,
yeah.
and just like the Norwegians back then, crack skier, amazing guy, and trying to do the same journey as us, and
Mm.
in effect he beat us the entire journey. He was ahead of us a bar, I think, one day, and we were coming back down towards our finish line, realizing that we'd lost in a sense. When we're going on, it's all right to be second, in this journey, considering we're racing against a Norwegian pro skier kind of thing. And he ended up doing probably the most amazing act of sportsmanship, of kindness, of humility. He ended up waiting 3 kilometers short of that finish line, that imaginary line, to wait for us so we could finish this journey together and we could all get that record. And I mean, it's still to this day, it blows me away. I mean, I absolutely love the bloke. I really do. He's a phenomenal guy. If you ever get to meet him, he's just a hilarious, crazy person. But to be honest, like at the start of the journey, I wanted to hate the guy, but he was a hard guy to hate. We talk on the satellite phone every 3 weeks or so, or 2 weeks, and he was so open with information. He'd go, guys, if you're suffering from that issue on the trail, this is what I would try, and he was helping his competitors. And when we got to the finish line all together, we ended up getting stuck down there for 30 hours before the plane could finally pick us up. And we asked him why. Why'd you wait? Why'd you wait for 2 whole days? The two blokes you barely knew. And he was like, guys, if I didn't know there were, two crazy Aussies out there skiing behind me, I wouldn't finish this journey. So I wanted to show that respect to you guys. It's amazing to do a trip by yourself, but it's very sad to celebrate by yourself. And I wanted to not downplay the journey that we'd all been on. So a phenomenal guy. And so coming back from Antarctica with that in my mind, seeing what Alex did, I was psyched on the idea of doing another journey, but by myself. I wanted to see if I had the mettle of could I do a long drawn out trip like that, like Alex, and maintain my sense of humanity, like he did. And so I started planning a trip to go right across Australia. And I wanted to hunt, gather, live off the land. And it was 5 months after Antarctica where I met Lauren. And I kind of given up on the idea of love. I kind of like put it in the too hard basket, had failed relationships and all that sort of stuff. And fell head over heels. We got married, started having a family. And the idea for a journey, a solo journey, really started to die because it's not only is it that 3, 4, 5 months of doing the trip, it's the years of preparation and planning that we got to be pretty focused on. So this idea had kind of died a little bit for me, and the person who saved me from that was actually Lauren. She says to me, I can see you're struggling with the need to satisfy that adventurous bug in you, but also the desire to be a good dad, and you can't reconcile that. So you can't reconcile this adventurous life and a family life because there is anecdotally a high rate of divorce and adventure. There really is. And so she's like, well, why don't I help you with that? Why don't we go on your next family as a journey? And I was like, oh shit, I've married the right woman. And
Yes.
yes, yes. And so we decided to try and dumb the trip down halfway across Australia, stick more to sort of tracks, dirt tracks out there, and then take Morgan. And I still to this day think this journey was really, really born out of too much red wine, sleepless nights, and just a madcap idea, and it just all combined to this perfect storm. Yeah, it is possible. It's bloody hard work.
Yeah. Okay. And so you were dragging 160 kilograms across the ice in Antarctica.
Yeah.
How much gear does a 15-month-old need on a self-supported trip across the outback?
An unbelievable amount. An unbelievable amount.
Okay.
So we had we we had two carts. So my wife Lauren pulled a cart behind her that was a modified Burley design sort of like bike carrier. Yeah, and we sort of like got a bike carrier for a kid, and then we gave it steroids. Like put these massive sort of huge wheels on it with 4-inch wide sort of fat tires on it. Changed the suspension and everything. And she was pulling that one, which probably weighed between 60 to 80 kilos with Morgan and all the gear that Morgan would need to survive on that trip. And then in my cart, it weighed up to on the heaviest stretch. We had like roughly 2 week stretches. On the heaviest stretch was about 270 kilos in my cart. And that was 155 liters of water. So pretty heavy. And if you're talking about the load that a kid needs, nappies, diapers, on that kind of trip, we had to find a fully compostable eco solution so that we could actually burn these nappies without any plastic going into the environment. How many nappies do you think we would have needed on 102 days in the outback, Will?
Oh, wow. So, I mean, I'm guessing maybe 5, 6 a day over
So
100 days. So 600 nappies.
I think we counted it out at around 843.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you obviously had to carry all of those.
Well,
Yeah, there's
yeah.
no resupply.
Actually, so the one thing we did do is with that journey, every 2.5 weeks or so, we were able to sort of either stop in at a station or a small town. And so what we did
Hmm.
is we actually sent out like things like nappies, nappies and
Yeah.
other food to these spots along the way. So
Okay. Yeah.
we resupplied ourselves every 2.5 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think you'd have to. I mean,
you can't, you
800
can't.
nappies, that's like a caravan's worth.
Exactly, you can't do it. I mean, like we'd still be
Yeah.
walking right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And how did Morgan, I mean, it's an incredible experience for a child to have. How did she find the experience, do you think?
Honestly, she did better than my wife and I. Like she really did. And I probably learned probably the biggest lesson I've ever learned from adventure, or at least that adventure from her. Like the teacher of that was a 15-month-old. So at the start of the journey, Morgan had only started to walk, or yeah, started to walk 2 weeks before the journey. So she was taking her first steps. And so she was going to learn how to walk in the outback. Now the outback's not a fun and cuddly place. There's lots of vicious thorns out there. It's pretty harsh in an environment, and so she's there walking along in a little baby slipper kind of things, trying to walk for the first time, all barefoot, and she'd step on these thorns and they'd go into her feet. And she'd cry and scream. I mean, some of these things were big. They'd go into my tires. I had 11 flat tires over the course of the whole trip, and or she'd fall over and she'd get them stuck in the palms of her hands. And for the first 3 weeks or 4 weeks of the trip, she'd land them and she'd cry, she'd scream, she'd holler, and I'm like, shit, I am the worst dad in the world. I've irrevocably broken my daughter. She's going to come back from this scarred. And it was funny to notice that the cries slowly started to die out, and she would fall into these things, and then by a certain point in the trip, she'd step on a thorn and lift her foot up and just go, ooh, prick. You'd flick it out and she'd keep running. Like her response to painful stimuli, to the fact that she wouldn't get satisfied quickly. So like if she wanted a bottle of milk, would have to light a fire, would have to do all these steps. She learned patience out there as much as a toddler can. But what I learned from her is that I think as adults, we have a preconceived notion of what we think we should be doing and what normal is. It's keeping up with the Joneses, it's the status quo, it's having all the mod cons. And especially when you have a kid, you're taught to really batten down the hatches and just stay at home, keep life as easy as possible because everything's hard with the kid. For Morgan, though, she didn't have that preconceived notion. So her life out there became normal. So as long as she was with mum and dad, then this was exactly what she was meant to be doing at that point in time of her life. And just to see her take that on, I'm like, I need to do that more with my life. I need to stop looking at other people and comparing myself to them and just focus on my own path. Because as an adult, you get too caught up in that. You really do. And I think if we as a society could learn to lose that to a degree, I think it'd be really beneficial.
Absolutely. I think it's been described as the original mind that children have, where they have no preconceived ideas, no prejudices. Everything is new and exciting and vibrant. And I think that state of mind, it exists in all of us, even through adulthood, but we forget that it's there. And I think being around children, especially a child like Morgan out in the outback, that must have really rekindled that for you.
Yeah, it really did, and it's made me super conscious of it now. So I'm noticing Morgan. She's now 4 years old, just turned 4, and I am noticing in her a lot of traits that I'm teaching her. Subconsciously, you learn a lot from your parents. It's that whole very Jung and Freud kind of thing where you pattern off your parents, and a lot of those childhood traumas are all positive things, are what sets your foundations. And I'm seeing certain things that I'm like, wow, she's learned that from me. She's learned that response because that's the way I'll react in certain situations. She's picking up that from me, for good and for worse. There are some negative things. I'm like, geez, I've got to work on myself as a parent because I'm teaching her bad habits here. So, yeah, no, it really is. But there's such an open mind. It's a sponge to start with. And just, wow, if we could tap back into that, if we could have a hard reset almost for us as an adult.
Just press that reset button.
Oh, it'd be amazing. It'd be amazing. And I think to a degree that's what adventure does. It really does, because you can't afford to hide behind ego. You can't afford to hide about certain because when you're on a trip, the environment doesn't care about you. It really doesn't. It's just going about its daily business. Whether you live, you die, you do well, you don't. It doesn't care. Your trip fails or not, it doesn't care. And so it strips that back, and realizing that I don't know. You've got to just realize and look at the bigger picture. You really do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what this also is touching on is, I'm curious to know about your motivations for adventure now, and how those might have changed over the years. You mentioned at the start, there's inevitably some ego involved when you start to get some media interest. But it sounds to me as though you've really grown as a person through those experiences, and perhaps the reason that you do these things has changed. Can you speak on that for a moment?
Yeah. No, I 100% can. So, I mean, looking at the purity of the first couple of trips I did, going right back to sort of high school, the outdoors and adventure became a bit of a safe haven for me. I was a pretty confused kid at school. I was the cliched overweight fat kid at school, and this, that, the other, and just very lost. But my parents lived. There's a bit of a backstory there. My parents lived in Indonesia. I went to boarding school in Australia. Sent over there when I was 11, and I was probably too young for that environment in reality, and so I retracted into my shell. And the outdoors is what helped crack open that shell to a degree, and I found self-confidence in the fact that I was able to do things in an outdoor space rather well. I'm not going to be a phenomenal climber or anything like that, but I mean, just like I'm comfortable in that environment. And so I've lost track of myself right now. The
Talking
original
about
question
motivations
again?
for adventure.
Yeah. So back there, it was about finding myself. And what I've noticed as I've grown, like there was a certain point with the Tasman that there was, some ego. There's flipping it off at other people. I can do this. I want to matter. Antarctica was me trying to, I suppose, prove that to myself again, and to be incredibly honest about this. Antarctica could have been any journey for me. Like I really could have. Like, don't get me wrong, I really wanted to go down to Antarctica, but I just wanted to go out and suffer on a big trip. I really did at that point in my life. I wanted to go on another journey. I wanted to test myself, and it could have been a massive ocean row. It could have been down in Antarctica. It could have been up in North Pole. I just wanted to push myself hard, and I got that. And so the outback trip with the family was completely different, and the motivation was trying to work out how I could merge family and adventure and try and build a life that I don't need a vacation from. I've spoken to a lot of my peers who are in the adventure space, and doing a trip with Lauren, my wife, and our daughter. They were like, "You're doing what I wished I could have done or could have kind of tried to work out." And it's trying to find that balance, and you do struggle with it. You struggle with pushing too hard on the adventure side, and because it is your family, it's not an adventure partner. Ultimately, though, the number one thing that drives me is probably FOMO. To be completely honest, is the fear of missing out. Like I'm a pain in the ass at times. My wife will go for a bushwalk, and my wife will say, I'm always late because I want to check out what's at the top of that hill. Or if we don't quite get there, I'll be so pissed off and irritated with myself. So I'll always push it a little bit too far, and and also I don't want to have any regrets. I don't want to look back on life and think about the things I could have done. I want to look back on life and regret the decisions I made, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. You got to go and get after it.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. Yeah, it's a big wide world out there, and we only have a very limited time to do all these activities.
Absolutely. And so what's next? Have you got any plans for the future for your next trip?
Yeah, yeah. So vaguely have some ideas and thoughts. I've got a pretty long to do list of all the adventurous things that I want to do. But that said, it'll be pretty rough to take, Morgan, our first child, through the outback on this massive, epically long expedition, and then Dylan, our second daughter, just take it to the local theme park. That that doesn't quite work.
Yeah, you've got to be fair. Yeah.
Exactly, it's got to be fair and
Yeah.
it's got to be equitable. So I think there's going to be another big family journey. Like I
Great.
think there is, and we are looking at a hyper long cycle trip because
Mm.
I feel like with two kids that is possible. But there is the family to do list, and there's also the Justin more sort of, I suppose, pointy end of adventure to do list that I've got. And
Mm.
like on the family side of things, obviously sailing, that's another thing that we
Mm.
just have to do.
Mm.
Would love to as a family unit live in a different country as well. So that's
Mm.
on the cards. But on the pointy end, I've always wanted to do a massive ocean row, and I don't think I'm completely done with polar journeys as of yet. So there's nothing definitively I want to say this is what I'm doing next, but the next journey I think will be a big family cycle trip. Yeah,
Great. Yeah, I look forward to hearing about it.
yeah. I think with two kids,
Yeah.
that's gonna up the ante a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Great. Now, many of our listeners are medics working on the front line at the moment. They're practicing extreme medicine on their doorstep. Is there anything that you'd like to say to them?
I mean, the first and foremost, you've got to say thank you. You really do. I mean, thank you so much for all the hard work and sacrifice that you guys are doing for us, the general punters out there. That for half the time, the general population can be pretty ungrateful at times, or there's a certain demographic in society that might not be as well educated and doesn't quite know all the facts or understand what's going on, and they're acting out of fear. They're acting out of fear of change. So please forgive them for that, and I'm sorry for that. But also going back to that analogy of for the first time, humanity as a whole is on well in our generation's lives. We're on an expedition together. We're weathering this storm, and to be pretty honest about it, you guys are the ones that are the captains. You're the ones that are the critical people. We are just passengers below deck. So thank you so much for all that hard work. And yeah, I mean, different countries are doing. Some places are doing better than others, but like you guys are all doing a fantastic job, and it makes me wish I continued on with medicine. Actually, to tell the truth.
Yeah. Thanks, Josie. That's awesome. And how can people find you online?
Online, fairly easy to find. Although I think there's an American baseball player that's got the same name as me who pips me in some of the searches. But a couple of websites for you: www.justinjonesy.com. So it's Jonesy. There's links from that to the other websites like the Family Journey, the Jonesy's.com. But I'm also going to be launching another one called adventurethinking.com, and that's around applying an expedition and sort of adventure mindset to everyday lives. And it's the realization that I've had that I'm a different person at home to the Jonesy that's on a journey. And it's about trying to work out the triggers. My wife was the one that pointed this out to me. I had a massive hissy fit one day about, I think I spilled a cup of coffee over some papers, and I had this massive tantrum. And she was like, "What's going on with you?" Because like if this happened on an expedition, you just get on with it and you just deal with the situation. And here you're having a bit of a hissy fit. And I realized that on an expedition, I have a very expansive sort of open growth mindset, whereas at home when I'm comfortable, it's very closed. And so learning the triggers to switch between that. So there's going to be some fun stuff there, and going to be talking to some interesting people on that.
Yeah,
Could
that
be fun
sounds
to
like a
share with
really
people.
interesting project. Yeah,
Mm.
taking that expedition mindset into the domestic environment. Yeah,
Yeah,
easier said than done.
domestic environment to business to personal life.
You're right. Yeah,
It's everything. But yeah. So and on all the social media things, Justin R
yeah,
Jonesy. Yeah,
yeah.
that's.
Great.
But mate, awesome. This has been so much fun. Like
Yeah,
seriously.
likewise. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. Well, oh, happy trails, everybody.